Okay, well, and then maybe we can start, and then people can still join on.
If you want to wait a few more minutes, I'm also fine with that. I don't have to leave exactly at the top of the hour, so.
All right, let's check. What do we have?
It's up to you.
Okay. Okay, well, and then maybe we can start, and then. Right, I see. Yeah, I guess it's better to start, because then when we are done, then for Ukrainian participants, it will be like traffic jam situation. So they will be in the rush to leave. And in any case, we will have a recording available if you don't mind. So
yeah, that's fine. No
people
worries.
can still rewatch the beginning.
Okay.
We already see some active members in the chat. The topic of this webinar is right answering the questions I've been asking myself for the last year. Okay, Andrei, I'm afraid you will not really like the major idea of Jason, because, well, Andrei is the great guy that I know, and he claims that capitalistic society and capitalism perfectly succeeds in well, in making a sustainable future, creating sustainable future. But that's a long story, ladies and gentlemen. So good afternoon, everyone. We will talk about this, but I'm happy to continue this series of webinars by ReThink on development and recovery after the COVID-19. And we are happy to have today Dr. Jason Hickel from Britain, the anthropologist, economist, author, and I always say the creator of Sustainable Development Index. And is it right, Jason? Is this you who introduced this index last year?
Yes, it was me.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for joining. And one more thing is that I would like to say thank you to Baker Tilly Ukraine, Alexander Puchkun, Alexander Baskov for supporting this event. And thank you, guys. And it would not be possible to host it without your support. Then we have, well, Jason, the floor is yours. The screen is yours. If you have slides, just go ahead.
Okay, sounds good. Yes, thanks very much for the introduction, Roman, and thanks for having me as part of this seminar series. And for all of you watching and listening, it's very good to be here with you. Looking forward to some of the discussion after this. So I'll probably speak for about half an hour. I want to introduce the concept of degrowth, which is really exploding in popularity right now across Europe. As a strong response to climate and ecological breakdown. So we'll see where that goes. And I want to discuss ways that we can draw on principles of degrowth to confront the present economic crisis. And I will also have a discussion about the circular economy and what that can offer us with respect to some of the work that ReThink does. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Just give me 1 second to get going. I have a few slides. All right. Is that clear there, Roman?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, yeah. So I want to start with this image, which is a very powerful image, and I think and really represents probably the most important innovation in ecological science over the past couple of decades. It's called the planetary boundary framework. And what it does is it shows us where we are globally as a human civilization and economy with respect to what we call the planetary boundaries, right? So where you see green is where we're within the planetary boundary. Where you see yellow is where we've overshot the planetary boundary, meaning we're entering zones of potential ecological instability. And where you see red is where we're sort of dramatically in excess of what scientists say are safety thresholds and are at risk of running into potentially irreversible tipping points in the Earth system. So as you can see, climate change is obviously a big issue, and this is the one that we talk about in the media constantly these days. But what I want to use this image to illustrate is the fact that climate change is not the only crisis that we face. Okay, as you can see, biodiversity loss, which is represented here as genetic diversity and biosphere integrity, is in a zone of dangerous uncertainty. Okay, species extinction rates are extremely high, relative to the pre-industrial rate. Land system change is also a zone of significant danger. This is effectively deforestation for the sake of conversion to agricultural land, specifically for animal farming. And then biogeochemical flows in the bottom there, also a red zone. And this is effectively chemical runoff, mostly from industrial agriculture, from very intensive industrial agriculture, right? Which causes, ocean dead zones and soil depletion and so on. So again, this is not just about climate breakdown, the crisis we face, deforestation, soil depletion, ocean dead zones, fish stock collapse, insect die-offs. This has been gathering attention across Europe in the past few years as well, in the wake of significant scientific findings. Species extinction, I mentioned earlier, but also recent reports have indicated that since 1970, something like 68% of all animal, plant, and fish species have disappeared, right? So there's been a real collapse in sort of the biomass of the non-human world. Now, the question we want to address briefly here is what's driving this crisis? And the answer I'm going to give you is growth. Now, we live in an economy that is organized fundamentally around constant expansion, right? This is the defining feature of capitalism. So in a capitalist economy, we have to continue to expand extraction and production and consumption at a rate of about 3% per year in order to stay afloat and so that firms can make aggregate profits. That's about the historical average rate, and also is the rate that is targeted by policymakers around the world. So now, in this sense, capitalism is the very first intrinsically expansionary system ever in human history. And its expansion is on an exponential scale, which is strange for us because we're used to thinking of expansion in terms of linear growth, but in fact, obviously, growth is exponential. And so the global economy effectively doubles at a rate of about every 23 years, right? So by the middle of the century, the economy will be roughly 3 times larger than it is today. After 100 years, the economy multiplies by a factor of 11. I mean, this is how quickly growth ends up scaling up, right? So what does that look like in material terms, in terms of impact on the planetary ecology? Ecological economists use an indicator called global material footprints, which basically what it does is that it adds up all of the material stuff that we extract and produce and consume every year, everything from timber to fish, from minerals to metals and plastics, everything. And what we can see is that there's been a steady increase in the total global material footprints since measurements began. The red line here represents what scientists agree to be the maximum sustainable threshold. So in fact, it should be between 25 and 50 billion tons per year. So 50 billion tons is the maximum they have set for safety. And we blew past that threshold in the late 1990s, right? Now, at the time, there was some expectation, some hope that a shift towards services and improvements in technological efficiency would lead to a reduction in material use, despite continued growth in GDP. But in fact, what we've seen is the opposite. We've seen that there's been an acceleration of material use, and we're now exceeding the planetary boundary on this, the safety threshold in this, by about 90%. Okay. Now, there's a very tight relationship between GDP and material use. This is real GDP measured against material use over time. What we can see is that there was a slight relative decoupling in the first couple of decades of this series, and that has disappeared in favor of what is now happening, which is effectively a recoupling of the economy, a kind of rematerialization of the economy. The global economy is becoming more materially intensive in the 21st century, not less. And this is despite a really dramatic shift to services and despite continued improvements in material efficiency. So in terms of the technology that we use. So this raises lots of questions. We can discuss this a little bit in the question answer if you want, but this is the trend that we're dealing with. Okay. Now, crucially, I should emphasize here that the language of the Anthropocene is incorrect. The Anthropocene narrative makes it seem as though all humans are equally responsible for the crisis that we face, when in fact, in reality, overshoot is due almost entirely to overconsumption in high income nations, right? So if we look at the material footprints in per capita terms by nation, what we see is a graph that looks like this. The red line here is the global material use boundary, represented in per capita terms. So about 7 to 8 tons of stuff per capita is what scientists say is a sustainable threshold. And we can see that the vast majority of the world consumes much less than that. In low income countries, it's about 2 or 3 tons per capita. In lower middle, about 3 or 4. In upper middle income countries, it's just about at the boundary. And in high income countries, the average is about 28 material tons of stuff per person. In countries like the US and Australia, it's much higher, in the region of 35 material tons of stuff per person. So crucially, if everyone in high income nations were to consume at the average rate of the rest of the world, we would not be in a condition of ecological breakdown right now. Right. Now, the reason I should mention, the reason that we use material footprint is because it's a very useful proxy for ecological impacts across all indicators. As material footprint rises, ecological impacts on all planetary boundaries also rises. There's a very tight relationship between the two, and so material footprint becomes an important proxy for ecological impacts. And so what we see here is that if all nations were to consume at the rate of high income nations, we would need roughly the biocapacity of about 4 planets to sustain that kind of consumption. We also see that the vast majority of growth in material use has been coming from high income nations. And that's the difference between the blue bar here and the orange bar. You see a real explosion over the past couple of decades in high income nations. Okay. And crucially, the consequences of this overconsumption hit the global south disproportionately. So I want you to take a look at this data and see what you make of it. Growth in high income nations relies, and we know this for a fact, on a large net appropriation of resources from the rest of the world, right, in the global south specifically. So for instance, in 2015, the latest year of data that we have, northern resource exports to the south, in terms of all materials embodied in exports, was about 5 billion tons of stuff, okay? Meanwhile, southern resource exports to the north were about 15 billion tons. What this means is that the north relies on a net extraction of resources from the global south in the region of about 10 billion tons per year, right? Now, so this constitutes an ecological drain from the south. What this means is that the high income nations are effectively consuming the forests and the minerals and the lands and energy of global south nations, which are materials they could be using for their own use, right, to meet human needs and so on, which are effectively being taken out, okay? And the impacts of excess northern consumption are therefore offshored to the global south, right? So in high income nations, people consume tremendous amount of material stuff, but the ecological impact of that hits poor countries. And you can see that in the form of what's happening to the Amazon right now, what's happening to the Indonesian rainforest, what's happening to, with the mines in the Congo, with lithium in Bolivia. Over and over and over again, we see that the impact of excess northern consumption is actually happening in the south. You don't see it happening in Finland or in England, right? In the same kind of way. Something similar is happening when it comes to climate change. Now, what this graph represents is responsibility for climate breakdown by nation or region, okay? Now, this is in terms of emissions in excess of the safe planetary boundary, which scientists say was 350 parts per million, which we crossed collectively in 1990. So emissions in excess of that boundary are what are leading to the dangerous destructive effects that we're seeing today. Who is responsible for those effects? We can break it down and it looks like this. So the US is single-handedly responsible for 40% of excess emissions. The European Union is responsible for 29% of excess emissions. This is cumulative historical emissions, right? The global north as a category is responsible for 92% of excess emissions, whereas the global south, which is all of the continents of Asia, the Middle East and North Africa, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, is responsible for only 8% of excess emissions. And yet, the costs of climate breakdown hit the South hardest. In terms of economic cost, the South suffers about 90% or more of the costs, and also 98% of the deaths related to climate breakdown in terms of everything from storms to floods to droughts to disease, et cetera. Okay. If we look at it geographically with a map, then this is kind of what it looks like. We see that, where you see red is nations in high level of excess emissions, where you see green In the top there is nations that have not overshot their fair share of the planetary boundary at all in terms of emissions. That interestingly includes China. Although China, this data only goes to 2015, China has probably overshot its emissions boundary as of 2020, okay, making it a net contributor to climate breakdown. Now compare that to the map below, which shows multidimensional climate vulnerability. And what we see is that the countries that are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change are all in the global south, and they are exactly the countries that have done the least to contribute to it, right? So it's important for us to recognize that the problem of climate breakdown, just like the problem of excess resource use, is effectively one that is colonial in nature, right? If we are not attentive to the colonial dimensions of the ecological crisis that we face, then I think we're fundamentally missing the point, okay? Now, so effectively, growthism, to the extent that GDP is very tightly linked to ecological impacts, specifically material use, then the pursuit of continued growth in high-income nations has a kind of colonial dimension to it, right? And the South basically suffers twice over. First, from the appropriation that fueled Northern growth, right? So the appropriation of resources, labor, atmosphere, et cetera, and then second, also from the emissions from that growth, right? So if we know that the rise of Western Europe in terms of their industrialization depended on the slave trade, depended on extraction from the colonies during the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries. And so too now the effects of that growth are hitting the South again in the form of climate breakdown, right? So there's kind of this double dimension to the coloniality of growthism in the North, right? So the question becomes, what do we do about this? Now, I want to focus in here on the question of climate change, since that's the one that is most urgent for most of us. This graph here shows you historical emissions in the black line there, and then the blue line shows us the emissions trajectory on the assumption that all nations that are signatories to the Paris Agreement uphold their commitments under that agreement to reduce emissions, right? What we see is that even if all nations do uphold their commitments under the Paris Agreement, what we see is that emissions will not fall at all. Rather, they will continue to rise, and temperatures will reach about 3.3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Now, this is vastly in excess of the boundaries set by the Paris Agreement itself, and scientists are very clear that temperature rise of 3.3 degrees Celsius is nothing short of catastrophic, and is not a future that we want to condone whatsoever. It is incompatible with organized global civilization as we know it. Okay. Now this is a curious question, right? Why, despite the fact that this includes all of nations' commitments to emissions reductions in the Paris Agreement, why then are emissions actually rising? The answer to that is basically heavy reliance on speculative net negative emissions technologies. We'll talk about that shortly. But meanwhile, I want to focus us in on the IPCC special report that was published in 2018 on what is required for us to stay under 1.5 degrees of global warming. And this is the graph that they published. Historical emissions on the left and the future emissions trajectory that's necessary on the right here, right? And what we see is that, of course, we have to cut emissions in half within 10 years globally, and then get to zero emissions by the middle of the century, right? Looking at this trajectory should make us all very concerned, because this requires nothing short than a rapid reversal of our present direction as a civilization. And remember, this trajectory is a global average target, right? For high-income nations, which have contributed most to climate breakdown, they need to get to zero by 2030, under the provision in the Paris Agreement that specifies common but shared, common but also differentiated responsibility. The nations that have contributed most to the problem have to do the most to affect the transition. So the question we have before us is, okay, is it possible? And the answer is theoretically yes, and this is the good news. We can do it with a Green New Deal. Now, this is a big shift from previous discourse, which is basically, let's just focus on market mechanisms. The market will save the day. Clearly, that hasn't worked for the past, half century. So there's been a real shift towards a policy-directed transition under the umbrella of a Green New Deal. right? And the idea here is you have to actively scale down fossil fuels. Now, I want to emphasize that what a Green New Deal has to include is basically a cap on fossil fuel use that is scaled down year on year with annual targets, right? And at the same time, you have a rapid rollout of renewable energy, right? Now the question then becomes, right? That's simple enough. The question then becomes, can we do this while still growing the global economy at existing rates, right? Now, let me emphasize again that 3% growth per year means nearly tripling the size of the global economy by 2050, right? So the question is, can we decarbonize the entire global economy by 2050 while at the same time tripling its size? Recognizing that the more the economy grows, the more energy it requires. And the more energy it requires, the more difficult it is for us to transition to renewables because you have to develop and lay out so much more infrastructure, right? So all of the existing empirical data on this says no, even under the most optimistic possible policies. And again, the reason is basically because the more you grow the economy, the more energy demand is required and the more difficult it is therefore to transition. So the whole idea behind post-growth and degrowth economics is the less you grow the economy, or even if you can scale down energy use, then the easier it is to transition very rapidly to renewables, right? So keep that in mind. Now the question is, why is no one freaking out about this? Given this obvious tension between existing policy objectives, which is basically growth at all costs, and our commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement, right? The reason is because of BECCS. Virtually all nations are assuming that sometime in the future, in the second half of the century, we will have a new technology known as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which will be basically an energy system that will at the same time suck carbon emissions out of the atmosphere, okay? So the way it works is that you plant massive amounts of huge tree plantations all around the world, then you cut down those trees and turn them into pellets and ship them to power stations around the world and burn them for energy. And then you capture the emissions from the smokestacks and store them underground where they can't escape. And therefore you have an energy system that actually takes carbon out of the atmosphere, right? Now, scientists have been lining up for years to say that this is a dangerous assumption. We should not rely on this assumption, right? The assumption here, of course, is we can keep emitting now, exceed our carbon budget by a long ways, and then hope that we'll be able to pull it out of the atmosphere later in the century, right? So it's a huge gamble. The technology does not exist at scale. And therefore, if we can't develop this kind of technology, then we're basically locked into a high temperature trajectory from which we will never be able to escape because you can't reverse climate breakdown on human timescales. Okay, but the other problem is that BECCS requires a huge quantity of land, about 2 to 3 times the size of India, and that has to be arable land. So you're taking away from land that is required for food production. It also has a huge burden in terms of the water and chemicals it requires. This is intensive monoculture plantations, which scientists are very clear will further drive biodiversity, will further drive soil depletion, further drive water depletion, basically exerting pressure on all other planetary boundaries, right? So it's an ecologically incoherent solution, right? And even if it does work, it might help you solve climate change, but also at the same time, it exacerbates pressure on other planetary boundaries and on human communities, right? You can guarantee this land is not going to be given up voluntarily by countries like Denmark. It will be given up, it will be effectively appropriated from global South countries for this purpose, right? Effectively to enable high-income nations to continue to extract and produce and consume and use energy, they'll have to colonize effectively land from the global South. So the IPCC report for the first time in 2018 acknowledged that problem, and they developed a scenario, the lead scenario for accomplishing emissions reductions consistent with 1.5 degrees Celsius that does not rely on BECCS, right? How do you do it without BECCS? This is what you do. The IPCC was very clear about this. You scale down aggregate material production and consumption in high consuming rich nations, right? As you scale down material production and consumption, this shrinks total energy demands, okay? Making it easier for us to accomplish a rapid transition to renewables, right? I have to emphasize, this is the only workable model the IPCC has ever developed that does not rely on speculative negative emissions schemes in the future, okay? So they want us to take this very seriously. So it's interesting to have an approach to reducing emissions that focuses on reducing resource throughput. Why? Because it takes an extraordinary amount of energy to extract and produce and transport all of the material stuff that the economy uses each year. The less of that you do, the less energy you use, the easier it is to accomplish a rapid transition to renewables, right? So this is known as degrowth. It's a planned downscaling of resource and energy use that's designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world and to achieve our climate objectives in a safe, just, and equitable way, right? Now, the good news is that degrowth can be accomplished while at the same time improving people's lives and advancing human progress, right? This is where it gets exciting. And the reason is because we know for a fact, and the peer-reviewed literature is very clear on this, that rich countries do not need more GDP growth, right? After a certain point, which rich countries have long since surpassed, the relationship between GDP and social indicators, poverty, well-being, happiness, wages, life expectancy, education, etc., everything completely breaks down, right? This should be liberating news for us. So for example, if you take the USA has a real GDP per capita of $60,000, right, per person. Now, compare that to Portugal. Portugal has a real GDP per capita of about 20,000 US dollars per person, okay? So 60% less roundabout or more. And yet Portugal has longer life expectancy and outperforms the US on virtually every social indicator, right? Despite having 60+% less GDP per capita than the US does. How do they do that? They do it by sharing existing income more fairly, okay? And by investing in robust, universal public services. Okay, over and over again, it's clear that you can do this with a relatively little GDP per capita. And when it comes to delivering strong social outcomes and flourishing lives for all, that is what matters. And this is why so many countries are able to achieve extremely high levels of life expectancy and other social indicators, outperforming the US by a long shot with significantly less GDP per capita, right? That should be inspiring to us. And the reason is because it's just not growth that matters, it's the distribution of income. And so if you look at the distribution of new income from GDP growth right now, on a global scale, this is what it looks like. The richest 1% capture about a quarter of all new income from growth, okay, over the past 40 years. The richest 5% together, that's about half of all new income from growth. And what this means is that half of all of the labor that we're rendering, the extraction of materials that we're doing, the emissions that we're emitting into the atmosphere, half of all of that is done in order to make rich people richer, right? This gives you a sense for the profound inefficiency of growth as a strategy for improving people's lives. It just doesn't work. It doesn't deliver the outcomes you want, okay? Now really briefly, I want to ask to address this question. Can the circular economy rescue growth, right? The EU says it can. All we need to do is shift, they say, to circular economy principles, and we'll be able to generate basically green growth, right? Now, scientists unfortunately reject this claim, and I deal with this question at length in my new book, Less is More. But let me just run over some of the key points here. The first point is that most material use cannot be recycled, right? So 44% of materials that we use is comprised of food and energy inputs, which are irreversibly degraded upon use, okay? 27% is net addition to material stocks, right? So things like buildings and infrastructure, et cetera. That's a net addition because we're growing our material stocks, right? And material stocks you don't recycle on any meaningful time frame. Also, recycling rates are effectively declining. It was 9.1% in 2018, and in 2020 it was 8.6%, right? Now, why is that happening? It's not because our recycling technology is getting worse or that we're recycling less stuff. In fact, we're recycling more stuff. But the problem is that all our gains in circularity are being outstripped by growth, right? So if you're trying to achieve a circular economy in a growth-oriented economy, then you're basically fighting an uphill battle because growth demands a constant appropriation of a constant net appropriation of new materials, not just as a recirculation of existing materials, right? And so in a growth-oriented economy, you cannot accomplish circularity, okay? It relies on virgin extraction. And so yes, we must do everything possible, like ReThink is doing, to pursue circularity, to pursue recycling at maximum possible rates. This is essential, and I'll talk about why shortly. But as long as we're doing this in the context of a growth-oriented economy, it's not going to work. Okay, our gains get outstripped by growth. it is easier to improve circularity when aggregate resource use is declining. In other words, in a degrowth scenario, okay? That should be easy enough to grasp. So circularity is desirable, but is not compatible with growth. And one of the reasons for this is not just because of what I've just described, kind of the scale effect of growth, but also because growth, in as much as growth requires surplus extraction, it needs an outside, external to itself, okay? And so it's obviously cheaper for capital to extract from virgin forest than it is to recycle existing material. Why? Because you don't have to pay nature, okay? So in order to extract maximum surplus, capital is incentivized to find cheap nature, right? Just as it's incentivized to find cheap labor. And so in order to do so, it's going to forego recycling in order to prioritize virgin extraction, right? So if we were able to maximize recycling, what you effectively do is you internalize the materials that capital needs to use. They become more expensive, which is good from the perspective of ecology, but bad from the perspective of capitalist surplus accumulation, okay? So here again, we see that, that capital's pressure to achieve constantly rising rate of surplus in the form of growth is a pressure that mitigates against our desire for a circular economy, right? So the two are really at loggerheads, and that's important to recognize. Okay, so degrowth, how do we do it? Now, what I want to emphasize here is that this is not about changing personal behavior, right? This is about creating a new economic system that does not require endless growth in the first place. So I want to break from earlier environmentalist models that try to blame people for consuming too much. I do not see consumers as the problem, right? Consumers I see as effectively a victim of a machine that is organized around constantly increasing extraction and production and consumption, right? Because our system is organized around growth, people have to consume more. It's not an option, right? And there's all sorts of pressures to make them do so, okay, which I'll discuss shortly. And so it doesn't make sense to target consumers as a problem and guilt trip them like many of the environmentalist movement has tried to do. What we need to do is change the system so it doesn't require growth in the first place, okay? Now, the first step towards doing that is to abandon GDP as a measure of success and change how we measure progress. GDP is a bad metric, okay? What it does is that it counts all the stuff that we extract and produce and turn into money, but it does not count the costs of doing that. So if you destroy a forest and turn it into IKEA furniture, GDP goes up, but it does not count the cost of losing that forest, okay? And so too with whatever, strip mining for coal, et cetera, et cetera. So there are alternatives that we could use. For example, the genuine progress indicator, which is probably the most robust alternative measure. It starts with GDP, and then it subtracts negative social and ecological consequences of GDP growth. And so you get a more balanced measure of progress. Now, what we see when we measure GPI against GDP, we see that the two rose together more or less up until the mid 1970s. But since then, they've completely decoupled, right? So real progress has been declining, has been stagnating or declining, whereas GDP continues to rise, right? So if politicians and economists were focused on maximizing genuine progress as an indicator, then they would be incentivized to do things that improve human ecological well-being and reduce human and ecological costs, okay, at the same time. And that would change the way that our economies operate. But I want to emphasize that, crucially, this alone, in and of itself, is not enough, okay? Because even if we start measuring other things like well-being and ecological impacts and targeting different kinds of approaches, then in a capitalist system, material and energy use will continue to rise in the background because that is what capitalism intrinsically must do, okay? So what we need to do is we need to have specific targets around scaling down material production and consumption. And this is really where ReThink's strategy comes into play, okay? So one step would be to ban the practice of planned obsolescence. Think about the things that we use in our households every day: refrigerators, washing machines. Think about your laptops, your smartphones. These products are designed in many cases to break down much earlier, much sooner than they actually need to, okay? Lifespans for white goods, like in your kitchen, are actually declining dramatically from about 40 years in the past to about 7 years today. And this is admitted openly by manufacturers. Why? Because they know for a fact, if you want to increase turnover and grow your business, if you're selling washing machines and laptops, you need to make sure they don't last too long, right? So you need to sabotage them somehow so that you generate customer turnover, product turnover. This can be, okay, so I mean, this is an example, right, of how capitalist incentives actually ends up being irrational with respect to human need and irrational with respect to materials, right? But with a ban on planned obsolescence, which can be introduced quite easily, then you can mitigate against some of that, right? You can also legislate extended warranties on products, okay? So that if it's possible to make a washing machine that lasts 40 years, then you have to do that, and the company is responsible for repairing it up until that date, and that effectively means that instead of that, if washing machines last 5 times as long, then we consume only 1/5 as many. This is a very powerful gain in terms of reducing material throughput with no loss to people's access to the goods they need to live well, right? That's essential. We can introduce a right to repair so that instead of having to take your laptop and smartphone, et cetera, to the authorized dealer for repairs, it should be repairable by anybody with some skills in doing so, right? So any general repair shop should be able to have access to the hardware in order to repair it with generic components, right? That's what a right to repair would effectively enable. Right now, of course, if you want to get your MacBook repaired, then the cost of repair is prohibitively expensive, so it actually becomes more rational for you to buy a whole new product, right? So that has to be legislated against, which again can be done very easily with laws on right to repair. And there are laws like this that exist already in the EU. Food waste is another one. 50% of all food that's sold in high-income nations is wasted, right? Usually because of supermarket advertising schemes and 2-for-1 schemes and so on. Okay, these can be easily regulated against because food is a big component of material throughput in the economy. Banning food waste can significantly reduce material throughput with no loss, again, to human well-being. Okay, we can cut advertising expenditures. We know there's a direct association between advertising spend and material throughput in an economy. We also know that there's an inverse correlation between advertising spend and people's happiness. So if we can legislate against advertising expenditure with simple caps that reduce year on year, then you achieve not only a reduction of material throughput in the economy, but also a reallocation of capital to where it's more needed, perhaps, and a significant improvement in human happiness. And that's been demonstrated over and over again in empirical research. We can also shift from private transportation to public transportation. We know that in every respect, public transportation is much more material and energy efficient than private transportation. But we also have to have a conversation about actively scaling down ecologically destructive and socially unnecessary industries, right? So right now we have this assumption that all industries must grow regardless of whether or not we actually need them. But we can have a conversation about which industries are big enough already and which industries are too big and can be scaled down. Which industries do we still need to grow? So we might need to grow renewable energy and public health, but we don't need to grow the SUV industry or the private jet industry. We can scale those down, right? So a much more rational approach to an economy is to have a democratic conversation about what industries we want to grow and which ones we don't. Ultimately, ecological economists are very clear, however, that the kind of transition that the IPCC is calling for in terms of reducing material use is going to require a declining annual cap on annual resource extraction. Okay, and this can be introduced very easily with a kind of cap and dividend system at government level. Now, this is an important question. If we're using only 1/5 as many refrigerators and washing machines and laptops, then there's going to be 1/5 as many jobs in the industries that produce those things, okay? Now, and this is one of the reasons why governments have, up until now, been very reluctant to introduce the kinds of measures that I'm calling for. What about jobs, right? In fact, we need to, according to the dominant narrative, we need to grow the economy, even in sectors that are unnecessary for us, simply in order to create new jobs to mop up existing unemployment, right? There's a much more rational way to approach this, and that's simply by shortening the working week. This is not a radical idea. This idea was proposed by John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s and has been evaluated in empirical studies over and over again since then. It's highly workable, has enormous social and ecological benefits. We don't need more jobs. What we need to do is share existing necessary labor more fairly. So as you scale down unnecessary material production and consumption, then you can shorten the working week so that existing remaining necessary labor is shared more fairly, reducing the working week to 30 hours a week or even less, right? Under such a scenario, you're still producing all the things that you need for flourishing lives for all, and yet you also have more leisure, right? So people can do things that they actually care about and live more flourishing lives. You can also do this with a public job guarantee, with a living wage, which raises incomes across the board for workers, and ensures that people can be shifted from downscale industries like SUVs and fossil fuels into industries that are more important, like public healthcare and renewable rollout, okay? At the same time, we have to significantly reduce inequality, right? One of the main reasons that politicians give for the importance of growth is that it's to improve people's lives. But we know for a fact that we can accomplish our social goals right now without any additional growth at all, simply by sharing what we already have more fairly, rather than plundering the earth for more, okay? In rich countries, including the Ukraine, the problem is not that we don't have enough GDP. The problem is that it's all captured at the top, right? It's irrational to assume that more GDP growth is a meaningful solution to this problem, right? It's ecologically insane. So this to me is crucial. And we need to expand public goods so that people can access the goods they need to live well without needing ever rising incomes in order to do so, okay? So you can imagine it's much more difficult for you to live a flourishing life in the USA, where you have to pay extremely high rates to for-profit companies for healthcare and education, right? Versus Finland, where healthcare and education are provided universally for free, and other services, public transportation, rent controls, et cetera, affordable housing, et cetera, so that people can access the goods they need to live good lives without needing to pursue high income and therefore unnecessary production and consumption in order to do so, okay? But we also need to talk about debt cancellation, right? We know that debt is a major driver of the growth imperative because debt comes with interest, and interest is an exponential function. To pay back exponentially rising interest, you have to have exponentially rising income, okay? Whether you're an individual or a household or a state or a business. So if we can cancel unpayable and unjust debts, you liberate some of that pressure for growthism, okay? There are many ideas for how this can be done. Crucially, and this is my final point, we also need to shift towards a debt-free currency. Our existing currency is based on the fractional reserve banking system, where commercial banks create currency out of thin air, effectively, and it comes with interest. They create currency by loading it into existence. A public money system would be one where public body creates money, debt-free, and spends it into existence, as Keynes originally promoted, in order to fund things like public services and even a job guarantee, right? So you're spending into the economy to create use value, improve people's lives, without introducing additional high levels of debt that require growth down the road. Modern monetary theory has done quite a lot to explore these possibilities as well. I'm going to conclude briefly with just some brief thoughts here about the present crisis, okay? Given principles of degrowth, can we think about what it might look like to achieve a recovery from this crisis without growth? Now, what I want to emphasize here, again, is that right now economists are talking about this, and politicians, as though the problem we face is a problem of low GDP, right? What I've argued here is, in fact, we don't need to think of the problem that way. The problem is not low GDP. GDP does not matter. We don't need more GDP. The problem we face right now is that people don't have access to the livelihoods they need to live good lives. They're unemployed, et cetera, et cetera. So address those problems directly, rather than just trying to grow the economy at all costs and hope that some of it is going to accomplish those solutions for you. It virtually never does, right? So in this present context, we could use something like a shorter working week, okay, to distribute existing necessary labor more fairly, a public job guarantee so that we can shift labor that is unused into important work that has to be done. Things like ecological regeneration, things like recycling, things like care, right? Things like the renewable energy transition, things like retrofitting homes with insulation, et cetera, right? There's a lot of work that has to be done. The problem is not a lack of jobs. The problem is that the existing economy is not addressing that kind of work, okay? So something like a public job guarantee could do that. And the good news here is that it's wildly popular. In survey after survey, we see that public job guarantees have support from around 70 to 75% of the population, right? This is the kind of thing we should be advocating for as we move towards a post-growth economy. So I address these topics in an engaging, accessible way, and much more fully than I've done here in Less is More, which is available if you're interested in learning more about that. But I want to move now into taking some of your questions so that we can explore these ideas more fully. Thanks.
Yes, Jason, thank you. This is fantastic. By the way, we've pre-ordered, well, we've ordered the book already. It's somewhere on the way coming to Ukraine right now. And it will be available at ReThink office for Ukrainians just to borrow and read. And yeah, we will spread the word. Thank you so much for this striking, actually, points, because this is probably the most unusual suggestion and speech that we had so far, including that we also had the honorary president of the Club of Rome. I have quite some questions in the Q&A in the chat and also in other sources. Let's start from the long one. The main challenge related to degrowth, in my opinion, writes Zabaheta from Finland, is how do we convince the bureaucrats in European Commission, OECD, World Bank, etc., other hegemonic structures that we do not need, that we do not have much choice but to descale. So how do we convince them that we have to descale? And yeah, what tools do we citizens have in our hands to do that? And direct democracy faces as many or even more challenges as degrowth. Just a statement from Sabahat.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yes, I mean, look, it's tricky because there's an extraordinary ideological lockdown around growthism, right? And this is, to me, this is fascinating because you see political parties on the left and right alike, both, they quibble about how to distribute the yields of growth, right? But on the question of growth itself, they're united. They literally never question it. And so it's truly one of the most, ideologically powerful ideas of our time, which is why I refer to it as growthism, because it's almost like a religion in a way, right? It's never questioned. And if you talk to somebody and you question growth, then they will look at you like you're crazy. So the reason that we use the term degrowth is because it immediately challenges this assumption that we should all just agree that growth is a good thing and we should pursue it, because that is going to lead to our collapse, right? And so it's a challenging word in that sense, but I think the challenge is really quite important. Yeah, so in terms of convincing bureaucrats, look, there's some organizations doing some good work on this. The Wellbeing Economies Alliance is one of them. It's based in Scotland, and it's basically trying to rally heads of states and mayors around this idea of abandoning the pursuit of GDP growth in favor of targeting well-being and ecological indicators directly, right? It's been quite successful. So as you probably heard, New Zealand's recently abandoned GDP growth as an objective in their budget. So did Scotland, so did Iceland. So some key economies have been doing this. This is the kind of thing that an organization like ReThink could pursue in the context of Ukraine. And I think that'd be very powerful because again, I support everything that ReThink is doing in terms of their advocacy for recycling and circularity and so on. But I think we have to recognize that that's a limited strategy if we don't have a broader view of what's happening in the economy, right? And so if we can mobilize politicians and social movements around a broader legislative agenda around this, then I think that we're in a good spot. Now, what's powerful about what ReThink is doing is by targeting reductions in material use, this helps us accomplish quite a lot of what I've been talking about. So that is really important, I should emphasize.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize that we are not targeting recycling or something. We are more talking about circular design and pre-cycling. And pre-cycling is actually one of the ways to lower the material footprint. So
yes, exactly. That's exactly right. And I think the idea of pre-cycling is essential. We need products that are designed to last a very long time. Yeah. And crucially, this has to come from legislation, honestly. There's no way that businesses will voluntarily do this. It's extremely rare. You get things like Fairphone, right, which is a modular phone that is basically, that follows these principles, but you can't convince Apple to do this. their business model literally depends on iPhones being replaced every 2 years,
Yeah,
right? So you
but
need legislation to force them to comply with these kinds of regulations. That's
right.
essential.
But you can force you can use green procurement to say you need to buy fair phones only for your workers. Like the
Yes.
city of Amsterdam did. There was a lecture by a lady last year in Amsterdam, and she said, "Well, we have made an experiment, and we have ordered 10 fair phones, and the others were Samsung or something like that." And of course, fair phones are not that stylish, and they're not that handy because they are thicker, because they are designed to be basically, how you call it? Well, refurbished, and
Yes.
you can still kind of unscrew them and actually change the components, so they are not that fancy. And people at first, they were not happy to be with Fairphone because they are not so fancy, but I mean, it's the matter of innovation, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. A question from myself, because I was thinking about this guaranteed income scheme, and but don't you think that in conditions of not sufficient education, people will be just lazy and will be just doing some crimes, or I don't know what? Don't you think that this will just influence badly, that, well, people will be just relaxed and reluctant to do anything at all?
Yes, let me address this question. So universal basic income, I actually support it, but I'm going to qualify this in a few ways. First, let me address your question. Yes, there's concerns about that. In reality, these concerns are not borne out in the empirical evidence. What we see is that when people have a basic income, sure, maybe 0.5%, 1% of them may choose to do nothing. To me, I don't mind. That's fine, right? The vast majority of people, the overwhelming majority of people, it improves their health outcomes. It improves their mental health outcomes, and it enables them to do socially useful things that we actually need, right? People get involved in maintenance. They get involved in food production. They get involved in social care, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I will say this: I think that the job guarantee is a more powerful alternative to basic income for our purposes. And I say that for two reasons. A, because we have a lot of work that has to be done, right? And so the job guarantee is a way to ensure that necessary work for the transition, for the ecological transition and ecological regeneration is done. And we're meeting community needs, real community needs, right? And also in degrowth economic models, it's very clear that while a universal basic income increases the level of debt in the economy, a job guarantee does not, right? And so it's much more feasible in degrowth paradigm to operate a job guarantee than a UBI. And that's one of the reasons that I emphasize job guarantee in this presentation.
Yeah, I also can see what is happening now to the stocks of Tesla in the US, and people say it's all because, well, those unemployed just got a lot of spare money and they want to invest in something, and yeah, let's buy Tesla stocks then. Why not? Uh,
Maybe. I think the majority of people who got that extra money probably spent it on rents, but I'm sure
well,
that some people did buy Tesla
okay,
stocks.
yeah, that it's even more realistic, I guess. Yes. Well, the next question is, carbon border adjustment mechanism suggested by the EU Green Deal is predicted to affect mainly not rich countries like US, but countries with less developed economy like Ukraine. Well, this is true. Do you think such an approach could effectively contribute to decrease of CO2 emissions?
So,
The
so
carbon
this
border mechanism.
carbon border mechanisms, yeah.
I've heard about I've heard of this thing in a real case. For example, Ukraine is a huge exporter of goods to the EU, and this is something you were talking about resources. Of course, we are number two exporter of food to the European Union after, I don't know whom, states, for example, and we also export a lot of steel, a lot of tubes, pipes, and all that. But of course, all these factories and production facilities, they are old, so they are emitting lots of CO2. And now with this carbon border scheme, it will have to change, or the products will not be that, how you call it?
Look, yeah, no, look, I completely agree with that approach to carbon. I think that's essential. I mean, it's an important step. We can all agree on that, right? I guess the thing I'm trying to emphasize here is that these existing approaches, right, are not going to cut it, as long as we are increasing total energy use. And so it's not really ultimately only a question of carbon. It's a question of total energy use. Right, we know for a fact that we can switch to renewables, reduce emissions that way, et cetera. But we have a carbon budget which is extremely small, a remaining carbon budget extremely small. And the only way we can reduce emissions fast enough to stay within that is to reduce energy use. And that's why we can have these conversations about carbon, et cetera, about carbon accounting, et cetera. Very important. But if we're not reducing energy use actively year on year, none of that is going to matter, right? So, and again, this requires a focus on reduction of material throughput. I should also add that this approach is a much more coherent approach to our ecological crisis, because it's not just about climate change. And so simply switching to renewables, right, is not good enough, because we still face ecological breakdown on all sorts of other fronts. And so reducing resource use in order to reduce energy use not only enables a faster transition to renewables, but also takes pressure off all other planetary boundaries. So it's a much more ecologically coherent response. And I think that the message we have to get across to EU bureaucrats introducing these rules is that that's good, but not good enough.
Right. Thank you very much. Another question was from Alexei, saying something like, if we are not in the global north as Ukrainians, does that mean that we still can grow? Because I have an addition from my side, because in the SDI article, you say that some kind of threshold where nations may stop is something like $14,000, if I'm right. And we have not reached that by far. So can we grow?
Yeah, so here's my perspective. Now, you could think of Ukraine as a high income country in many respects. And in that sense, I think the message would be growth is not necessary, right? Right, like, the key thing here is that you target the social objectives that you want to achieve. Do you want to improve life expectancy and education and wages and reduce poverty, et cetera? You can target those directly and abandon this assumption that simply growing GDP is going to magically accomplish those goals, because it doesn't, right? So that's one thing. If you want to consider yourself to be a global South country, and I realize Ukraine is on the boundary here, or a peripheral country, okay, or an upper middle income country, or whatever it might be, that's also fine. But even in those cases, we advocate that even global South countries. I'm from Swaziland originally, Eswatini in Southern Africa. What degrowth says about countries like Swaziland, which is very poor, is that you should abandon GDP growth as an objective. Target well-being, target ecological stability, target reductions in poverty directly. If that entails or requires some growth, then so be it. But it should never be an objective, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's quite crucial. I mean, GDP growth as an objective is a new phenomenon. It's basically from the 1960s, right?
Yeah.
And in the global South, in the 60s and 70s, there was resistance against it, and they were successfully pursuing well-being economies instead. All of that was reversed by structural adjustment programs imposed by the World Bank and the IMF in the 80s and 90s, at which point the pursuit of GDP growth as an objective was universalized. And that's why, as a consequence of that, every nation today pursues GDP growth as a core objective. We have to throw those shackles off, right? Even in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Then another question comes from Irina, who says, I like the concept of degrowth, and it all sounds like perfect world solution, but I am critical when I start to think about socialism principles applying that were applied back in the in the Soviet time. So that's something I was warning you about before the
Yes,
lecture.
I'm so glad somebody asked this. I didn't get a chance to address it. I'm not at all advocating anything like the USSR. The USSR was an utterly disastrous system, and there's nothing in any of the proposals that I've suggested that is anything remotely like them. Now, I also want to emphasize that the USSR was a growthist regime, right? The USSR pursued growth with a violent vehemence, and one of the reasons it was so destructive to human lives and ecology was because of its growth orientation. The USSR and the USA fought hard about who could grow their economies fastest, which model is going to do it better. Plans, what was effectively state capitalism versus free market capitalism, right? And both of them are ecologically disastrous. So what I'm calling for here, actually, in the book, is that we evolve towards a post-capitalist society, and that is one that is much more democratic than our present society is, which is not democratic. And much more ecological, that has a relationship of reciprocity with other people and with the rest of the living world, right? And what I propose is that democracy is intrinsically ecological, and I propose that shifting towards a more democratic polity is an essential step towards shifting towards a more ecological one, because over and over again we see that post-growth principles are preferred by vast majorities of people when given the option in public surveys. This is mind-boggling to me. I lay out dozens of survey results in the book to show that majorities in the region of 70% of people in Europe and other high-income regions actively support post-growth principles, right? And experiments that we have from studies done by Yale and Harvard academics show that in conditions of direct democracy, people are more likely to make decisions that prioritize human well-being and ecological stability and deprioritize growth, right? That to me is remarkable. So the kind of economy I'm calling for has never been tried before, but it's something that we have to develop creatively ourselves. And we should not be afraid of this process, because we are a culture that prizes innovation and creativity. We would never look at a smartphone or a painting and say that is the best smartphone or painting that has ever been created and will never be surpassed, and we should never even try. And yet for some reason, we look at capitalism and our imagination locks down. This is the only system we could ever have, and we shouldn't even try to invent a better one. What I'm calling for is for us to apply principles of reason and creativity and innovation to our economic system and build something fundamentally better.
Wow, thank you very much, Jason. Still have a few more questions. And it's already 5 o'clock, so we will try to wrap up soon. How the shift from one type of economical system to the other should be done, and what can I do as a citizen of my country? Well, again, it's kind of continuation of the question that we had before.
Well, no, it's an important question. And for me, the analogy is like this. Think about the civil rights movement, which is a movement that accomplished extraordinary social change in the US in the middle of the 20th century, right? Now, if you were living in the US as a white person during the segregation period, it would not be enough for you to say, I'm just going to sit in my flat or my house and try to not be racist, right? Nothing would change. You have to get outside. You have to connect with other people who are angry about the system. You have to build alliances, right? You have to build social movements, and you have to change what is ultimately a fundamentally broken and unjust system, right? The same thing has to be done in our present situation. This idea that we should just sit back and compost a bit more, right? And turn off the light bulbs or take shorter showers. We are going to die if we do that. So, I mean, of course that's important, but we have to mobilize movements that are capable of bringing about conversations about this and ultimately changing, government policy. And so I would encourage you to get involved with organizations like ReThink, with social movements that are addressing these concerns, with political parties that are mobilizing around this, and try to build change that way, because this is a systemic problem that requires systemic solutions. And tweaking around the edges or little behavioral changes here and there is not going to cut it.
Yeah, well, the means of ReThink is to work with education and innovation. So that's why we are organizing and hosting such sessions like today with you, Jason. So thank you again for joining us. And I think we have to wrap up right now because it's already 6 minutes past 5. Please note that the recording will be available at our YouTube channel. You can find it easily. Jason, is it possible to get the slides?
Oh yes, I can send those to you. Yeah, sure.
Yes, because normally we are sending just a follow-up email with the slides so people don't have to make print screens while they are listening, especially in this case because yeah, you get fascinated by the ideas and you forget to note them. So again, thank you everybody for watching, for joining. Have a good day, have a good week, and Jason, keep up the work you're doing, and very soon we will have your new book available in ReThink library, and success with all your discoveries, lectures, and in all your work.
Thanks very much,
Thank
Roman, and thank
you.
you also for the work that you and ReThink are doing. And thank you for the invitation to join you. I hope that it was useful to people.
Yes, definitely very useful, Jason. Thank you so much,
Great.
and
All
bye
right,
bye.
take care. All right, cheers. Bye bye.